Welcome to The Journey, a conversation on leadership, culture, and theology. My name is Vidal. I'm going to be your host for our podcast today. And I want to welcome you guys for giving us the opportunity to have a conversation with you. And today, as we have done it in the past, we do have a very special person to come and join us. I'm speaking of my brother, my professor, Dr. Ken Hugghins. Dr. Ken, how are you?
I am well, Vidal. How are you?
Well, I know that you are enjoying your coffee, and that's always a plus. That's always a plus. I just reveal a little secret before I push the record button that you were getting your coffee. And
Oh, you did? Okay.
well, I know it's a good day when coffee is present for sure, because I do enjoy coffee as well in the morning. So, Brother Ken, we're kind of launching into this month of October, and I just came back last night. By the recording of the podcast, I just came back from doing some services, chapel services, and a couple of engagements in regards to the Hispanic Heritage Month, which began back in September 15, and it will finish or conclude on October 15. So this is the month that apparently is an official kind of a holiday or emphasis in our nation for the Hispanic culture. And when I was at the chapel yesterday, today is Tuesday, so yesterday, Monday, Dr. Albert Reyes, which maybe you know Dr. Reyes, but he is the president for Buckner International. He did a beautiful job just giving us this overarching kind of a history specifically of Hispanic work among Texas Baptists. And I know Dr. Reyes is a sharp brother. I just didn't know that he was that connected and family, roots going to that. And I'm speaking of that, and I'm bringing that in our conversation today because I wanted for us to talk about biblical theology and that entire picture in the Bible. So it's the same manner that I'm sitting at chapel yesterday and I'm listening to Dr. Reyes, which for me, this is gold because, and you probably remember this, but I came to the United States when I was 17 years of age. So I'm coming as a young adult from a foreign country, and obviously now I've become more of a Texan. But this historical component is always beautiful to come back and be reminded that we are the product of this. So how would you make the connection? How would you relate this conversation to the understanding of the big picture of the Bible?
What is the history of God's work, not just in Texas Baptist, but in American? Yay, no. What is God's history of work with his creation? Wow. That sounds like what I call a God, the world, and related matters kind of discussion.
Yeah.
But I think the Bible is giving us that big picture. And it's interesting. Some of the major components, I think, are crammed in some of the smaller places. I mean, the first 3 chapters of Genesis are key. And it's not a lot of, now take notes and make this list. It's in Hebraic mindset. By the way, one of the best tools I found, at least for Genesis 1, is John Walton's The Lost World of Genesis 1. Very accessible piece.
Yes.
And of course, he focuses on some of the creation discussions, but it's really his vast knowledge of ancient Near Eastern thought that enables him to put the biblical story in that context. That always makes people nervous. No, God has revealed himself in the midst of cultures that are. What you look for are the unique things that God revealed that set a Christian worldview, the biblical story, apart from just the surrounding culture. So he does a good job of that. And pulling out from the things that are said in Scripture, not mechanically, but just looking, it's almost like literary analysis to some degree, whether you like that in high school or college or not. Just back up. What's the point here? What's going on? And I outline my biblical theology this way. I just came up with it a couple years ago, so I'm always open to refinement. You can find lists like this anywhere.
Sure.
But mine starts with God made. There is a creator. We can argue all day long about the details and should be able to give an answer to folks, but God made it. Humans who have a very special function in that creation, humans betray. And I say that in present tense because we continue to betray. And as a result, Genesis 3, chaos reigns. I was reading about a musical artist last night, Nick Cave. I'm not familiar with him, but I want to read some of his stuff. And he has lost 2 sons, teenage, I believe. He professes to have a Christian worldview, and he said that's what helps him make sense of it, and not just the hope, but the hard recognition that this is a broken world, and stuff happens, and it's not God's fault. It's not God causing it. God allows chaos to reign. The kicker from Genesis 4 on is God stays. God isn't just looking for an excuse. We sometimes can fixate on that Noah story of, okay, finally God's just going to have, all right, enough, to your rooms. Don't make me come back there, And part of the result of the Noah story is God's covenant. He will not destroy his creation in wrath. Wow. God stays connected to us. And then what you see, pieces being dropped throughout what we call the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, promises made. So what have we done? God made, humans betray, chaos reigns, God stays, promises made. I am doing something about this brokenness. And I am going somewhere with it. That's another thing about a Christian worldview. It's not cyclical. No, God is going somewhere. And what I would say in the biblical story is he invites us to come along, But the promises are kind of like marker stones, guide stones along the way. Here is how God is doing this. And it's easy to get hung up on each marker, which I think some of the specific theologies tend to camp out on some of those, the markers are showing God's tendencies and channels, but the markers, I don't think, are this is how you relate to God at this time. This is how you relate to God at this time. It was Paul who gave me the answer, where in Romans and Galatians he says, Abraham trusted God, and that was counted to him as righteousness. Faith has always been the case. Trust God. Trust what you know, yes. And the biblical people knew different things at different times. Trust what you know. And through the pattern, we begin to see God's personality, God's values, his righteousness, which is the way that he is faithful in relationships. So God stays, promises made, Jesus came. So much happens in Jesus, of course. Forgiveness for the past, wisdom for living now, hope for the future beyond the curse of death. And the church remains. We are the outpost of what God, we are the beginning in Jesus Christ of God's reclamation of his world. Now, that maybe puts too much emphasis on the church. Flip side of that is, in Christ, so much is enabled. that maybe wasn't possible before. I don't know. I'll have to think about that more. But then the ultimate goal is creation remade. And even as I listened to testimonies at a banquet last night for our pregnancy care center, our response to problem pregnancies and encouraging people to not choose abortion. But what I love about this ministry is their commitment. If you do, we are here for you.
Hmm.
Post-abortion recovery, this kind of thing. Mm-hmm. So, but where it's going is not just heaven, it is a new heaven and a new earth. And that is very hard for those of us from the Platonic tradition of spirit good, body bad. No, the Hebrew viewpoint from Genesis 1, God made it and he said it's good. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's been messed up. But Isaiah says God is going to remake it. No longer will the law of the jungle rule. The wolf will lie down with the lamb. Of course, I've always loved that. Yeah, the wolf will lie down with the lamb, but the lamb won't get much sleep. It's going to. I wonder how long it's going to take for the newness to wear off.
Yeah,
I don't know those processes. We all want to know. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's where God's going. So, wow, okay, that helps me know what is my part in this. Well, I'm part of the church of Jesus Christ. I need to know what God has done in Jesus Christ, but I can't know the real detail of that until I know the rest of the story. How does Jesus address the problem, the chaos? How does Jesus address human betrayal? Boy, he experienced it, didn't he? I mean, I've always said Jesus Christ, God in the flesh, experienced the worst that sin has to offer. Mm-hmm. 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 And that tells me plenty. God's not sitting distant saying, why don't you guys do better? Mm-hmm. He knows. He has entered into it. So all that to say, that's the big picture. So it reminds me, there is a creator, there is a God. We used to say in my church every now and then, kind of a funny mantra, but it's true. I'd say there are two rules to life. Number one, there is a God. They would say it with number two, it's not you. And I think that's part of the human dilemma, is making peace with that.
Yeah.
Particularly in a culture that makes all of us, we're all free to be God.
Exactly.
And which alienates us from each other, much less from God. Mm-hmm. 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 And
yeah, that sense of autonomy, that sense of independence, which obviously we are in a generation that we are definitely exalting it and worshiping that mindset to the point of I will say we demonize it. I mean, it's not working us. The exaltation of self, the self-dependent, self-absorption. Let me come back to you briefly, because again, you're giving us that biblical narrative of the overarching purpose, and there's a couple of things that just came to mind as I'm listening to you, and one of them that just resonated with me, because I think I think this is one of the biggest arguments in today's culture, where we're going through a lot of stuff as a generation. We have gone through a lot, and the world has gone through a lot. But one of the arguments is precisely the indifference of God in the context of pain, in the context of difficulties and devastation, and obviously there is beauty in the world as well. But people have gone through difficult seasons of life, and the argument has typically been the absence of God, the impotence of God, maybe even that sense of indifference of God. And you reminded us that if you were to accuse God of anything based on the fact that he came and dwelt among us, and he chose not simply to walk among us, I'm speaking of God through the second person of the Trinity, which is Jesus, but he chose to take our place, and he knew, or he knows, suffering. To me, that's extremely important, Dr. Hugghins, because once again, I'm not here to say that I know suffering. My understanding from the scriptures when it comes to suffering is that the Bible doesn't guarantee that everybody's going to suffer, but the Bible exhorts us to be ready if we go through suffering, if we go through pain. And Peter, I will say, that argues that he wants to make sure that when we suffer, it's not based on self-inflicted or rebellion or as a consequence of sin. All that to say that based on what you just explained and gave us that overarching purpose, the presence of God, the fact that he came and dwelled for us and created the newness of life. I'm always drawn into it, and help me understand this I guess this explanation. When Paul describes in Philippians 3, he's arguing, he's battling those Judaizers in the church in Philippi, and he speaks of how he finds joy and he wishes that he can join Jesus in his sufferings and somehow obtain the resurrection from the dead. Now, I'm thinking that hope and that view into what is to come is related to the reality that he has been resurrected spiritually, the newness of life. Okay. But now is the hope of a bodily resurrection. Correct. So going back to the both end of the conversation between the spiritual and the physical, the newness of a brand new world coming up. But all that to say, again, I'm coming back to the what you said earlier of the God who relates, the God who knows suffering, that there is no way we can continue to have this mindset that he's oblivious, he doesn't care. And because ultimately, if he really existed, if God exists, this would have never happened to me or to us or to our generation. So any thoughts on that?
Wow. I saw a television production one time of C.S. Lewis's God in the Dock. And C.S. Lewis presents God on trial. And there is a man who has brought charges. He's in the witness stand at the moment. And he's brought his charges against God. He's suffered. He's lost family, this kind of thing. I can't remember what turn in the courtroom. Somehow he saw God as entering into, he saw God crucified. He understood the mystery of incarnation in that horrendous moment. And he just sat stunned and he said, I am so sorry. I am so damn sorry. So I think you're right to pick up on, it's kind of like they say, you always appreciate when someone sits with you in your pain. In fact, I heard a wise counselor say one time, so many times people know you can't fix it. They just want someone to be a witness to the pain. Just validate. Okay, so sitting with them, what good does that do? So God suffers with us. Wow, that means we're all in the mess. Well, no, you've got to get the whole story, the resurrection, the down payment of hope. I kind of what I've been reasoning with is this. We want God to fix it. What does that mean? Give us a better environment? He did, and that wasn't enough for us. I mean, I think that's the point of Genesis.
That's right. That's right.
What was the problem there? It was in the delegated managers. The human beings made in God's image chose to do it their way. And the result is, and I think we're seeing that in, so many of the climate change arguments, environmental battles we're having, the consequence of technology. We're very short-sighted creatures. If it helps us right now, we're all on it. And there aren't many people with the wisdom or even the concern to stop and think, where's this going to take us? And that's where I think God was around to say, I'll help you with that as you manage. And how does all that work out? Is he going to drop it off of Mount Sinai? I don't know. But very few of us are taking time to try to find out. So if the problem's in management, here's what has to change. Basically think of all the evil we're angry about. Well, okay, some of it is natural. It's earthquakes and tsunamis and rains and hurricanes.
Hmm.
Okay, I just have to say that's a function of a fallen world. Creation is broken. It's at war with itself. Paul says in Romans 8, it groans as in childbirth, waiting for the birth of the new world to come. But most of what we're angry about is the suffering we do to each other. And so what I wonder, if what God has done in Jesus Christ assured us we are forgiven, we don't have to dodge him.
Mm-hmm.
And one of our favorite dodges is he lets everything bad happen. Okay, just hang on. You don't have to dodge him.
Mm-hmm.
You're forgiven. You can be recreated, born again, whatever. I mean, but it's a process. I think most of us like the idea of God zapping. No, we don't. We're part of the choosing, and God invites us to work with him. And what's the theological term? Sanctification, being made, restoring in us the image of God, the image of Christ, become more and more like Christ, who what? Trusted God in everything, turned to God in everything. Whereas we, like most 3-year-olds, want to say, I got this, and we don't know enough.
Mm-hmm.
So what if God is calling for some people in their recognition of, wow, responsibility, but they are forgiven for that. For some people who recognize I need help to be wiser, better in this life. For some people to recognize I was created to live in community with some people, as irritating as that can be. What is the epitome of that? Jean-Paul Sartre's statement, hell is other people.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, live in isolation for a while.
Mm-hmm.
We're created for that community. And what if God is offering to people to be part of a community? It's a struggle, and it's harder than it was at first because the environment is not what God intended. And there are still people out there who aren't part of the movement, who want to do violence. So yes, we will still have violence done to us. Mm-hmm. How do we as a community, are we learning to trust God and be a force for the beginning of recreation now? Does that make sense?
Most definitely. And the thing is, for me, going back into the recreation component and how God is going to do it, our ignorance or our deception, or I don't know if it's just pridefulness, the pride that we have is that I feel that sometimes we potentially agree with God in the concept of the newness of restoration of all things, as long as I get to define what that means and how we get there. Now, I'm using that terminology because you reminded me a while ago that the process of sanctification, which again, in Christian circles, biblical expectations, biblical worldview, biblical theology is part of the process, except, and again, this is where we come back to this understanding. When you look at the overarching purpose of the Bible, it gives the impression that sanctification, the ability to walk and to grow in Christ likeness. I'm drawn into Hebrews 5:8, where Jesus was perfected through his suffering. So in this case, would it be possible that maybe suffering is part of the vocation of the Christian? Maybe it's part of, what we're, again, I'm going back to Philippians 3.
Yeah.
In Philippians 3, Paul getting the comparison with the Judaizers and give them the resume, Hebrew of Hebrews from the tribe of Benjamin. And he puts all that to the side for the solid purpose, not only to know God or to know Christ, but part of the knowing is precisely to adopt, to embrace, to receive, being imputed, if you want to use that term, also the joining of the sufferings.
Yeah.
I guess the question now remains, if that's the case, or since that's the case, can we find purpose in the suffering? Can we find a reason? So again, I'm thinking as a parent, we have 3 kids, and I was present on the birth of my kids, and that was painful. not for me, but for Areli. It was very, very painful, but the pain was justifiable once that baby was born.
Right.
So
right.
I don't know if I'm making a very simplistic statement on that, but it's just the understanding of the why. We're going through what we're going through, but then the understanding, because even if you go to Romans chapter 8, which is a very well-known verse, verses 28, verses 29, that that we know, and again, I guess Paul is kind of a pretty optimistic that we're supposed to know. We know that in all things, God works for the good. And I'm thinking of the death of my mother back in 2019. And I'm thinking, I just don't see the good on this death, this separation. And yet what seems to be a loss in our midst becomes a win in the kingdom of God. But man, how do you make that connection? So I don't know. Any thoughts on that understanding of the sanctification, the process, how things are going to be restored in the methodology or the process? Because again, if you look at the life of Jesus, most of the time we look at Jesus as a historical figure, which he is, but more of the redemptive side, that this is what Jesus did. And we forget that what Jesus did was also a calling, or was also done for us, in a sense of this is the process of sanctification. So how do we wrestle with these things, Dr. Hugghins?
Oh, why don't you just drop evil and suffering on me today, and let's solve that for Christianity?
That's it.
I think we've all, that is, as people have said, that is the weak point in Christianity.
Mm-hmm.
Is there's a good and loving God, and evil still exists. A good and loving and powerful, all-powerful God, and evil exists.
Mm-hmm.
So either he's not very loving, or he's loving, but he's not very powerful. I think we're going to have to go back to relationship. God limits himself in a lot of ways. He allows us to choose, but he said all through Scripture, there are going to be consequences for your choices. So I think one of the things we have to make peace with is this is a fallen world. This world is not as God intended it to be.
That's right.
Now, it's not so bad we should destroy it or just treat it as if it's expendable. I think God, I sat in this banquet last night and I looked at the diverse people of Huntsville. And I have to sometimes remind myself, God is as desperately interested in that person over there as he is in me, And on their face, they bear the trials and the difficulties of life, or the joys that they found, or whatever. This world is not what God intended.
Mm-hmm.
And just the fact that I may sit there and even in judgment of some, that's not what God intended either. So pain is, pain's part of it. I don't think we seek pain for its own end. I think if we're not careful, and the early church made that mistake, let's suffer more that we might, be glorified more. No, suffering comes in a fallen world when we live in faith with God and others resist the way we live and trust with God, or we still encounter the brokenness of the world. And so, will we trust the God who experienced the brokenness and gave us the down payment of there is more? My mother passed away 2 years ago as well. And after a year and a half of Alzheimer's, and had a very good facility for her. She blossomed there, if you will. She was very happy. Of course, so much of it was during COVID and we couldn't be with her. Well, when they said it looks like it's the end, we were called in and were allowed to be in her room with her. Well, the end drug on for a week or so, but I wouldn't take for that. I put together a playlist of Bill Gaither and other hymns and stuff, and we sat and sang, and we sat around her and laughed and told old stories, and could go hover over her and hug her and kiss her, and but can I be honest? In that situation, thank God for death.
Hmm.
Because at a memorial service, we could celebrate a life that we know is not over.
That's right.
We're just deadgummit down the street from her. We can't get down the street, but we know she's at Jesus' house, and that's a good place to be. So yeah, we've got to learn to live with the hole and the loss, and that's very, very real. Don't let pie in the sky promises of heaven mask your pain. But don't let your pain rule out the whole truth.
I feel that this example you given, let me interrupt you here.
Sure,
this example
please.
you given so personal with mom and her departure, especially when you just made the statement that death becomes a positive experience in the sense of the fullness and the newness for her. It is a loss for us because we're the ones that get to grieve. For her, it's fullness, it's healing, full healing. But it seems that this creates, in my mind, I'm going back to my early years at East Texas Baptist University under Dr. Bob Utley's teaching, because he's got this big picture of the Bible given to us in the classroom and Old Testament classes through a timeline, and we had to memorize the timeline to pass this class. But anyways, the point is that when you look at the timeline and going back to the story with mom and her departure, it puts us as on a sense of an unresolved tension of losing her, but the hope that we have, the hope that we know that, once again, fullness of life, Jesus's house, which as you said. And my concern, and this is where I think your big picture of the Bible helps us. My tendency is, this is my tendency when I find myself in this unresolved tension of losing my mother, and yet the hope that we have as she has moved into Jesus's house, my tendency is to think, whether it's by default, naiveness, or convenience, I don't know what it is that Jesus died so he can come and resolve the tension.
Sure.
And what I find throughout the scriptures is exactly the opposite, that there is no, it's kind of the overlapping of the eras, that the kingdom has been established, but it hasn't been fulfilled. And we go back to what you said earlier, that ultimately, as difficult and as unresolved, and that tension is so tangible and so real between the grief and then the hope, it comes down to trust. Will I learn to trust him when things do not make sense? And even if they do make sense, because going back to the timeline of the Old Testament that Dr. Utley gave us and is very, very helpful. One of the things that it just hit me when I was taking his Old Testament survey classes, the fact that on the timeline you see on top the major world powers that God, and here's a key word, used to discipline his children. So ultimately, and I know we're not going to resolve the topic of evil and suffering, but the sovereignty of God, what God allows, and this overarching purpose ultimately will be fulfilled. What God established. And so again, just to review what you gave us, God made, humans betrayed. You spoke of how the chaos reigns because of the betrayal. Okay. Now, the beauty of this, and this is the good news of the gospel, that in the context of chaos, God stays. And this is where you spoke of God fulfilling his purposes. And part of the fulfillment, or how the fulfillment takes place, you spoke of promises that he made. So one of my favorite narratives in the Old Testament is Genesis chapter 17. That experience with Abraham and God, that covenantal experience, where it's just overwhelming to see that it is God who walks, the presence of God walk through the sacrifice. Abraham is just an spectator. And he's the one, that just blows my mind away of the promises of God. Then the promise becomes fulfilled in the person of Jesus. So Jesus came, church remains, and then creation is remade. So hopefully this big picture allows us, and I'm going to put this on the notes of the podcast, by the way, so people can have access to it. But Dr. Hugghins, for me, looking at this big picture, I'm going to go back to the unresolved tension, allows me that instead of simply calling upon the God that I'm treating him as some sort of a bellboy that is supposed to come into my rescue, and resolve the tension. This is the God who has done what he has done and will continue to do what he has established to do for the purpose of his people to trust in his reliability, in his trustworthiness, which is extremely difficult to do. And this is why we got to keep our mindset focused on the big picture. I guess the question that I have for you, and we're going to close our time soon, but as a preacher, as a pastor, as a Bible person, when I study the Bible at a personal level or Sunday school experience, how can the Bible teacher, Bible interpreter, how would you recommend, if Sunday's coming and I got to preach, Wednesday's coming, I got to do Bible studies, how do I help to, how do I study the Bible? How do I do Bible studies? How do I do sermons where I can relate, make the connection between what I'm teaching, what I'm speaking on, to this big picture of the Bible, where I can remind people that, as important as the book of Ecclesiastes is, as imperative as it is for us to follow the instructions of Paul given to Timothy, whatever the case may be, do you have any recommendations? How do Bible study can help us to go back into the bigger picture versus just, pulling, some sort of a moral teaching that I can just run with it? And,
Sure.
Any thoughts on that?
Not clearly worked out, but I think, understanding this big picture and that we get stops along the way in the biblical story saves us from the evangelical tendency. And there again, I'm trying to understand where this came from, and that's another discussion. But the evangelical tendency to treat the Bible as it's flat. It is a book of teaching. So every story is supposed to tell you how to do things. Well, boy, there are plenty of stories tell you not how to do things. Well, that may be a point too, And it's not just don't chase after women of other cultures when you're supposed to be a Nazarite and committed to God. And no, it's not an argument against intercultural. No, stop it. What's the point going on there? And the amazing thing, even about the whole story of the Judges, is God's continued mercy and faithfulness to his people, letting them reap the results of their choices. But always finding someone. And I think this is so interesting. I think, and I'm always open to correction or help in this, but I think sometimes we want to be so emphatic and protect God's sovereignty that really becomes an excuse to avoid our opportunity to choose in situations.
To take responsibility.
Will I be one who steps up in this and says, we must follow God? And different ways to do that. And in Babylon, it didn't mean Daniel and his buddies stood up in rebellion against. No, it just said we, in the midst of our painful situation, we are going to live in relationship with God and live that out as best we can. Boy, that's a powerful word for people who feel like aliens, you know, you don't, it doesn't always mean you fight. Jesus didn't call for that.
Mm-hmm.
What does it mean to be aggressively faithful? And that's where I think we come back into suffering. Suffering is going to happen.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Even the process of being faithful in your own personal life in the midst of oppressive culture, that's going to bring suffering. I would dare say, we're back to suffering, and I wanted to come back to this for a moment. This is how you heal a broken world. It's not God going, it's God saying, who will be faithful with me now? And let's begin to recreate it. Now, I'm not a post-millennialist that thinks things are going to get better and better with science. You know, the big question for me, Vidal, is how is God going to bring all this back together? I do not know.
Mm-hmm.
I do not know. And all I know is he's inviting me to be part of being faithful now. And that doesn't mean I'm exempt from either human suffering, those who would oppose me because I'm faithful, those who would oppose me out of their own random violence,
Mm-hmm.
nor that I'm exempt from the natural tragedies of a fallen world.
Mm-hmm.
But God has said, as Paul says it so succinctly, but he says it in the middle, talking to people who are suffering. God's still working, and he's going somewhere, and it's good. So we can trust him even in these times. And I've not been sorely tested in that yet. Some days I know exactly where I would end up. Yeah. I don't like pain, you know.
Yeah. Yeah.
But that maybe addresses two questions. Number one, this is the way you heal a broken world. Somebody enters into it and in faith in God bears some of the pain of the brokenness to try to teach, model, build something else in trust with God, the God who suffers with us.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
How do we relate that? I think just always reminding people we are looking at the story of how God is moving from brokenness to healing. Where is this piece of scripture in that story?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Are they trusting where God's going? They don't know it all. Quit imposing magical kind of prophecy, you know, on people who saw the end.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They saw a piece, and that piece is important when we come to putting those pieces together in a collection. I'm teaching the Gospel of John, and it's funny, in John chapter 7, all the people are saying when Jesus goes up to the Feast of Tabernacles, well, the Messiah is supposed to do this. Some say we won't know where the Messiah comes from. Some say the Messiah's got to be from Bethlehem, and we know where this guy's come from. And some say, all of them dealing with the pieces. You know, I always say the Jews had their own charts of how God was going to come back. Yeah. We have ours, and they're going to differ.
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, that's why we stay in communication with each other, to learn from each other. But I don't know how God's going to pull it together. But we see the pieces of him being faithful. And I guess I would go back to, what are the relational lessons? You know, what are the relational characteristics modeled in this passage? You know, Ecclesiastes, he's tried it all. Mm-hmm. He's burnt out. It's driven him back to God. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How? What's he going to do? Is he going to be faithful in Sunday school now? I don't know. Just sometimes, just to move people to that point, there is a God, and it's not me.
That's right. That's right. And again, coming back to the big picture that you've given us, and again, it's going to be on the notes of the podcast. Part of that faithfulness of God is many times is easier to see it, easier to contemplate, and to come back to it when you see what he has done throughout history. And the big picture that you're giving us, obviously, we get the privilege to be a generation post-resurrection, post-Jesus's first coming. And that should make us accountable and at the same time responsible that we do have more access, knowledge, ways to see that big picture. Obviously, evil has increased and things will probably get even more complicated. But at the same time, when you see that overarching picture of the narrative, I'm thinking about redemptive, eternal plan. It's a plan of redemption that he has established, and we get the privilege to be a part of it. Let me close with this, asking you, because we're always trying to bring some help and resources, and obviously, hopefully, we found some application. Do you have any recommendations, some helpful resources that we can provide for the audience? Any books, any tools that you have utilized, that you have seen in the past?
Can you print some of these as well?
Of course, we can put it on the notes as well.
Yeah.
Yes.
I had jotted down a few of these when you and I began talking about it. One is T. Desmond Alexander's From Eden to the New Jerusalem. Okay. Creation to Revelation 21-22. An introduction to biblical theology. It's not a very thick tome. It's very accessibly written. Another one that impacted me is Vaughn Roberts, Vaughan, God's Big Picture. Frankly, it was one little statement. Have you ever bought a book just because of one thing you read in it? Yeah, very guilty. But he made what was his statement about the garden in the rebellion of Adam and Eve? He said, it wasn't that they rejected good and evil. It was that they decided what is good and evil. I just went, wow, okay. It's not just do what I say. I think if we could begin to understand God is do what I say because I want what is best for you. You think you know what's best, but you don't know. You don't see the big picture. So at least stay out of the ditches is what he gave Israel with the law.
That's right.
But the new law, the new covenant that, Jeremiah and then Paul and the Spirit, I will guide you. Most of us are just content. I don't smoke, cuss, drink, or chew, or I don't commit adultery or lie or steal. Okay, great. But how are you living out what God would want? Seeking his wisdom in your marriage. And it ain't easy with your children, this kind of thing. So that statement really spoke to me. Albert Walters, Creation Regained, a Biblical Basics for a Reformational Worldview. We started off talking about Reformation Month. This was given to me by one of our academic church members several years ago. And as they had participated in a Presbyterian church at one point in their life, he said, this was very helpful. And again, it's a slender volume because he was seeing the kind of atomistic way Baptists may approach the Bible. He was saying, this just made sense to me. He's a thinker. He was a psychology professor. So he tried to understand how people think at a very popular level, but coming out of Sean Gladding is his name, Sean, and his wife's teaching of youth is a little book called The Story of God, The Story of Us, Getting Lost and Found in the Bible. And it's a narrative written from the perspective of God's people in exile.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And an older wise man, as they gather each time, older wise man recounting their story. He wants them to understand why they're there. They forsook the Deuteronomic covenant, where God says, I give this to you. If you do this, it will go well for you. If you don't,
that's right.
And then, the heart of God, when he says in the middle of talking to Moses, I think it's Deuteronomy 19, that they had a heart in them to want to do and live by my will, so it would go well with them. I mean, there's the heart of God. Not do this or I'll get you. do this. Oh, I want this for your good. So it tells the story up to, and then we'll leap forward to a house church, telling how Jesus fulfilled the story. So we used it as a church-wide study several years ago, and had a minister of education who wrote curriculum for it for the Bible study classes, and there again, just getting the big picture.
Yeah. Well, this is wonderful. This is very helpful. And again, we're going to put all of this resources, books that were mentioned. We put them on the notes, and people will have access. We'll make it clickable where people can actually go in and see the actual book, and if they decide to purchase or maybe find a copy or something like that, will definitely be very resourceful. Dr. Hugghins, we're coming to an end, and obviously we cover a lot of territory, which I don't know if that was the intention from the beginning, but it's always helpful. And I think our audience is going to find it helpful. We'll come back and continue the conversation in the upcoming weeks. And want to thank you for your time. Thank you for your investment. Thank you for the resources. And I'm looking forward to see how this big narrative, the biblical theology or the big story help us and allows us to move forward in today's environment and where we are today as churches, as preachers, as pastors, which that's part of what we're targeting and trying to bring those resources as well. So Dr. Hugghins, thank you again. We'll see you next time, and have a great day.
You too.